But when he returned to England, he quickly set about restoring order to his kingdom and reasserting his authority over his rebellious brother John. However, his first love was still France. In fact, he spent much of his reign locked in a bitter struggle with Philip II of France for control of the country. He gathered his troops and marched out to meet Philip. Then suddenly, Richard's attention was drawn to a small tower in the distance. The tower looked insignificant, but it turned out to be a major obstacle. As Richard's forces tried to attack the tower, they came under fire from archers on the top of the structure. They used advanced techniques and equipment, such as the battering ram and trebuchet, to dismantle the castle's defenses and construct new ones. Richard wanted to send a message to his enemies, a message of power and dominance, and he did that through the grandeur of the structure itself. The castle was built in a style that was both imposing and elegant. After the completion of Chateau Gaillard, Richard returned to France to resume his campaign against Philip. The Angevin Empire, which Richard had inherited from his father, Henry II, was vast and encompassed much of southwestern France in addition to England. He defeated the French king at the Battle of Arthenay in 1191, capturing several towns and castles in the process. However, his triumphs were short-lived as Philip was able to regroup and mount a counter-offensive. But the empire was also divided, with many of the vassals and nobles rebelling against Richard's authority. He was afraid that the townspeople might take advantage of their absence and launch a counterattack. They rode as fast as they could to the nearest major city to find a doctor to treat the king as wound. However, by the time the doctor arrived back in Chalice, it was too late. Richard's death came as a shock to his people and his enemies alike. He had been a powerful and charismatic ruler who had fought bravely in the Crusades and against the French. And that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative. Please let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Richard's condition had deteriorated rapidly, and he was clearly dying. As the wound grew increasingly worse, it became clear that Richard's health was in grave danger. His knights were becoming desperate and fearful that their beloved leader might die. Richard's preoccupation with the war against Philip meant that he was unable to devote enough time and resources to dealing with these internal issues. Over the centuries, his memory has been kept alive by countless works of art, literature, and film, which led to further instability and unrest in his realm. Now his ultimate goal was to reclaim the English territories that had been lost to the French king during his captivity. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe to join us on our journey through history. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay tuned for more exciting historical tales. It featured a high degree of craftsmanship and attention to detail, with each stone carefully cut and placed to create a beautiful facade. Richard immediately marched his forces to the town and laid siege to it. Despite its seemingly insignificant size, the castle was proving to be a stubborn opponent. It was well defended by the rebels who seemed determined to hold it at all costs. The castle was not only a symbol of Richard's strength, but also a reflection of his cultural refinement. According to the legend, as Richard stood surveying the battlefield, he was struck by a crossbow bolt in the shoulder. Now the wound initially seemed minor, but it soon became clear that it was deep and festering. Richard's reign saw the height of the Gothic architectural style, and Chateau Gaillard embodied this beautifully. The soaring arches and intricate carvings were a testament to the skill of the builders and the wealth of the kingdom. The castle was a beacon of civilization in a time of chaos and destruction, a place where art and culture flourished despite the constant threat of war. They built strong towers and thick walls that were designed to withstand the attacks of any enemy. He personally inspected the materials, directed the workers, and tested the defenses to make sure they were up to par. Finally, when the castle was complete, Richard stood back to admire his work. He knew that he had created a structure that would stand the test of time, a testament to his genius and power. In addition, they created a moat and a drawbridge to prevent any surprise attacks from the rear. In fact, he designed a series of fortifications that made the castle virtually impregnable. The work was completed swiftly and with great care, and the result was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. These archers were able to inflict heavy casualties on the English before they were forced to retreat. Richard's knights charged into battle with their swords and lances raised high in the air. They fought with the ferocity of lions, attacking and defending with equal skill and determination. Philip had seized large portions of English-held territory during Richard's captivity, including the city of Toulouse, and Richard was determined to take it back. So finally, Richard and Philip agreed to a truce and met together to discuss a possible peace treaty. But then something unexpected happened. Philip suddenly attacked Richard and wounded him in the shoulder with a spear. Now this was a huge mistake because it enraged Richard and his knights. However, this was not an easy task. The castle walls were thick and high, making it difficult for Richard's artillery to breach them. But eventually, the garrison was forced to surrender, and Richard's troops were able to enter the castle without further resistance. Once inside, Richard found that the castle was largely abandoned, with only a few defenders left to protect it. They went back into battle with renewed vigor and began to rout the French troops. Did he spend his last moments fighting valiantly in battle? Or was he perhaps planning his next crusade? Join me as we dive into the chronicles of Richard the Lionheart and uncover the details of his last years and his final moments. You see, the tower was actually part of an imposing medieval castle that had not yet been engaged by Richard's troops. This castle, which today stands in ruins, was named Chateau Gaillard, and it served as a key strategic point in the defense of the region. The castle was well fortified and defended by a garrison of experienced soldiers. Richard's attempts to dislodge them were proving to be costly in terms of lives and resources. We'll explore how he spent his last days, the battles he fought, and how he met his untimely demise. Welcome back to the channel. It's me, and this is Echoes of Empire, where we bring you the finest in historical storytelling. Now, Richard the Lionheart was truly a legendary medieval warrior. In fact, he was known for his bravery, skill, and chivalry on the battlefield, and he was also a devout Christian who saw himself as a champion of the crusade. So in his final years, he continued to fight against the enemies of Christianity in the Holy Land. But it wasn't just his martial prowess that made Richard so famous. He was also renowned for his personal qualities such as his honor, his loyalty, and his generosity, and even his enemies respected him for these traits. So Richard was captured by the Austrian Duke Leopold during the Third Crusade and imprisoned in a dungeon for 6 months. Now let's fast forward a bit, because Richard was about to get his wish. That's because he had just captured the town of Limoges and was besieging a small castle near the city of Chalons when he heard that the French king was marching toward the area with a large force. So Richard knew that he needed to make a quick decision. He could either continue the siege or he could abandon it and go out to meet the French king, and he chose the latter option. Now Richard's forces were smaller than those of Philip, but he was confident in his ability to defeat the French king in battle. As the battle raged on, it became clear that neither side would be able to gain the upper hand. Richard's knights were relentless, and they chased the fleeing French soldiers all the way back to their camp. And this is where things took a turn for the worse. So Richard decided to lay siege to the castle and starve out the garrison. When Richard had finished his business with Philip in southern France, he decided to deal with this troublesome Chateau Gaillard. Chateau Gaillard was constructed in stages, and Richard's engineers were able to build on the existing structures. But Chateau Gaillard was more than just a fortress. It was a statement. Richard spent several months overseeing the construction of Chateau Gaillard, working tirelessly to ensure that every aspect of the project was executed to his exact specifications. And what's more, the castle became one of Richard's most famous legacies, a symbol of his reign that would be remembered for centuries to come. However, Richard's efforts were hampered by the political complexities of the region. Despite these challenges, Richard managed to achieve some victories against Philip. It was during this time that Richard learned of the siege of Chalais-Chabrol, a small castle near Limoges that had fallen into the hands of a group of rebels. On April 1199, after weeks of fighting, Richard's men finally breached the castle walls and entered the town. And that's when something unexpected happened. It was obvious that Richard needed medical attention, but he refused to let his knights leave the town to seek it. Finally, after much deliberation, Richard allowed some of his knights to leave the town to seek help. With his last breath, it was said that Richard forgave the knight who had shot him and granted him knighthood. When Richard died on April 6, 1199, he was in the arms of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had rushed to his bedside upon hearing of his illness. Richard was buried in the church of the former Abbey of Fontevraud, where a magnificent tomb was erected to commemorate his life and deeds. After Richard's death, his brother John succeeded him to the throne of England, marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. And don't forget to like the video if you want to encourage us to make more videos like this.